But to me, if I look at like what's the trend that's here to stay, I think it's the mindset shift around how do I move away from I treat my network as confidential, secure, high trust, to I move to a model where I say I don't trust my network. Almost every customer meeting we've been in, people have brought up on their own, hey, we're thinking about zero trust. How do we actually like change our approach to security? So I think what we end up seeing is, yeah, in Europe, it definitely feels like over the last 2-3 years, it's been a dramatic change. I think over the last 2-3 years, we've seen a pretty big change, right? Where there's like a big focus on data privacy, data residency. I think some of it's driven by the landscape's changing.
Yeah, recently you announced the license change, right, towards USL.
And I think one thing we were very careful to do in all of our blog and all of our communication is we don't call it open source anymore. I think now you're almost at a point where it's tooling overload for developers. So now I think almost the pendulum swinging back the other way, where people are like, can I get an internal developer platform that sort of abstracts infrastructure once again from our developers, right? Like, how do I give them the easy button?
Welcome everybody to another Adfinis Open Talk. And here with us today is Armon, CTO of HashiCorp. A very warm welcome. Super nice that you're here. Now I'm Hofi, CTO of Adfinis, and with me is also Sandro.
I'm Sandro, sales engineer and member of the board of directors at Adfinis.
Please subscribe, hit that like button, and comment in the video section below if you have any questions.
So now, actually to you, Armon, we tried to find some information on Wikipedia, but there is no page about you. I don't know why. You might tell us why. So tell us, who are you?
Sure, yeah, happy to. And that's funny, you know, I've never actually checked what's on the Wikipedia.
No, we did.
I wonder what's
we
even
should
there.
contribute this.
Yeah. Can we open a page for you?
Yeah, like I wonder what's even there. Sure, so maybe quickly about me. You know, I grew up in Seattle area. So kind of born and raised Seattle, ended up going to University of Washington, which is sort of, you know, in the backyard there. That's where I ended up meeting Mitchell. So obviously, you know, co-founder of HashiCorp. So we ended up just randomly in the same computer science program, same year, ended up kind of overlapping in random classes, and became really good friends just kind of through the course of the program. And, you know, one of the interesting things for me was, as I did some internships, I ended up working at a few really large tech companies, and I actually really disliked it. I actually disliked it so much, I was like, I don't even want to work in industry. So I decided I wanted to be an academic and ended up applying to grad school. And so I ended up originally moving down to San Francisco to go to grad school and get a PhD, and, you know, wanted to stay on that track and, you know, stay in academia and sort of publish papers and, you know, not deal with the real world, if you will. And so, you know, as life is, you know, mysterious and takes you in weird ways, Mitchell ended up moving to, you know, a startup based in the Bay Area. He kind of, you know, we kept talking, and he was like, hey, you have to interview, you have to meet this team. Ended up sort of, you know, meeting that team. Really fell in love with sort of the culture and the founders and sort of that startup ecosystem and ethos. It was my first exposure, sort of not working at a mega company, and ended up sort of deferring grad school for a year to join the startup. That year ended up becoming many years, and ended up dropping out of grad school. And, you know, through that experience, both, you know, became really close friends with Mitchell, but obviously spent a lot of time then sort of in the real world trying to run infrastructure, right? So the ad company we ended up at was all based in AWS. We were trying to build these microservices, trying to deal with cloud provisioning and, you know, auto scaling and secret management, all this stuff. And we felt like there wasn't any good tooling for any of that stuff. And so we sort of home grew a bunch of stuff at the ad network. But when we would talk to our peers, I'm like, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? Everyone said the same thing. They're like, we're building our own tools to kind of solve these problems. We're like, this doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why is everyone building the same set of stuff? So ultimately ended up saying, you know, great, let's start HashiCorp to solve those problems. Ended up leaving the ad network to do it. You know, I ended up living in the Bay Area for 9 years. Now I went back. I live back in the cloudy city. I'm back in Seattle. But, you know, maybe that's sort of the brief history, if you will. Of
Good start for the Wikipedia page, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
We will just use that.
We'll use speech to text, and then it's fine.
There we go.
Copy paste to Wikipedia. All right, so we do have a few warm-up questions actually to get you up to speed. First of all, I have a few either/or questions, and the idea is you don't think.
Okay.
You just say either or the other, and if you don't want to answer, just leave it and say next.
Okay.
But they should be all okay, so that's
Okay.
nothing fishy or whatever. So, coffee or tea?
Tea.
Wine or beer?
Wine.
Vacation in the mountains or at the beach?
Beach.
Electric or combustion engine?
Combustion.
Oh, we should stop here. Azure or AWS?
Ooh, next.
I thought so, actually. I expected that. City or countryside?
City.
Linux or Mac?
Mac.
YAML or JSON?
Oh, that's easy, Jason.
JSON or HCL?
HCL.
Oh, that was easy. Yeah. VI or VS Code?
VI. VI for life.
Tabs or spaces?
Tabs.
Meat or veggies?
Meat.
Chicken or fish?
Chicken.
Go or Rust?
Oh, Go.
I thought so. Python or Ruby?
Python.
At Finis or at Finis?
Adfinis.
That was an easy one. Bern or Zurich?
Ooh. Ooh, that's tough, actually.
I thought
Zurich, I guess. Has the lake.
Wrong place to be.
Yeah. Has the lake, but Bern's more charming.
Yeah,
so.
it is. Summer or winter?
Summer.
Containers or VMs?
Ooh. I guess containers, yeah.
Android or iOS?
iOS.
Cheese or chocolate?
Oh, those are tough choices. Chocolate.
Actually, that's the word we needed to get our tasting started, right?
Yeah. Speaking of which, let's see if the magic works. Wow, wonders of technology, I guess. The colleagues prepared here a nice selection of different chocolates. Yeah, I would say let's have a taste of this nice Toblerone once.
So is Toblerone from Bern?
Yeah, initially
Oh, I didn't know
used to be, and it's actually the name is Tobler One
Oh.
because the name of the founder was Tobler,
Oh, okay.
and that was his first
his first
product.
chocolate, Toblerone.
And I think he's stick to it.
Yeah, he did a good
He
job.
didn't do anything
So you
else.
said originally, so did it move? It's not from here anymore?
No, I mean it's totally international now. Just too
It
international.
definitely tastes different than the U.S. Toblerone.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it tastes more like real chocolate.
The spacing also varies. In Switzerland, I think the spacing is a bit closer, the gap between the pieces, than abroad. Now, looking back the past few days, you again did what I think you've become somewhat kind of famous for, your whiteboard sessions. And yeah, I noticed something a while ago, that you're actually a left-handed person. So I'm a lefty myself. So I was always kind of wondering, how the heck do you avoid smearing over everything?
So it's a good question. The technique took a little while, but for me, it's like the way you hold the pen. It's like I won't hold it the way I hold like a pencil, because then it'll sort of smear in the same way. You kind of got to hold the very end of the pen. And it takes a little while to get used to writing so that it doesn't look like you're a child or a blind person, right? But I think it's like once you kind of get used to it, if you're holding it at the very tip, then it's like you have a few inches, so it's like the end of your palm won't end up smearing
nice.
it.
Yeah.
But it's like it takes a while, because naturally you think just hold it the way you'd hold a pencil, right? But I think it's the hand technique.
Did you actually have some coaching, training? Is there something you can recommend how you can use a proper whiteboard and do some whiteboards?
You know, the interesting thing for me was, I think you end up seeing the finished product, like when you see the YouTube videos. But I spent a lot of time on like, what's the right flow, what's the narrative? Because I think what's unique about a whiteboard is it's about the layering. So unlike if you think about a PowerPoint, when you go slide to slide, it's like it's a blank slate. You kind of reset it, but you don't have that with a whiteboard. Like whatever slide you're adding is layering over your previous slides. So you really have to think about what's the story you're trying to tell, what's the order in which things matter, and then like, how do you layer the concepts? Because otherwise it's really awkward if you keep going back and trying to erase parts of the whiteboard. So for me, it's like I spent a lot of time writing it on paper. So before I ever draw anything, I sort of like, what's the flow of like the things I want to kind of say? What's the order that's going to make sense? And then I almost storyboard it of like, okay, how should this kind of flow? What are the building blocks? And then I might do it a few times and be like, oh, okay, actually this doesn't layer right, or I need a different graphic or whatever. And then I think the other thing is, if you ever see me do the whiteboards like the same one over and over, you'll notice it's never quite the same twice, because what you end up doing is like every time I do it with a new audience, you get a certain amount of feedback. You're like, oh, if I put it like this, people don't understand it, so I'm going to phrase it a little differently next time, or I'll draw it a little bit differently. So it's constantly an evolution. So I think that honestly the best answer is it's just practice, right? It's just like when you do it the first 10 times, you kind of start refining it, but then when you do it the next 50 times, you really start to kind of polish, you know, the edges of it. So for me, I think that's honestly the best advice I have, is like start by storyboarding it, right? Like you sort of be like, what's the bullet points of the things you want to say? Then I translate to that to almost a storyboard. Then you have to actually practice it on the whiteboard and try and get, okay, does this make sense? And the more you do it with a live audience, and I think that's the key, a live audience, you get the real-time feedback. First, if you're just doing it for a camera, You don't know, did it make sense, did it not make sense? But when you have a live audience and you see someone's face looks confused, you know you didn't get it right? So I think it's the live audience is where you get the perfect feedback.
So we're almost at the end of those warm-up questions. Actually, we put these questions together last week at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's usually when my brain is not started. So it was hard to come up with cool questions. So we asked also ChatGPT.
Yeah.
So the next 2 questions will be from ChatGPT. So let's see what you say. So if HashiCorp had an official mascot, what would it be and what would it be called? As you know, this is Lunquill. It's our mascot from Adfinis. So what would it be for HashiCorp?
So I'll share like a funny one that was like an internal meme and still is an internal meme. You know, Mitchell did a trip to Japan, and as you can imagine, Mitchell's Japanese, Hashimoto, and the Japanese love mascots. And so they turned into this hilarious meme where basically people started creating different characters, but photoshopping Mitchell's face on them. And so my favorite one became, someone did one of Ash from Pokemon, where it was like Mitchell as Ash basically throwing a Pokeball, and it's like you got to catch all the HashiCorp products. So it's like you got to catch them all, became the like slogan, and it's like the Pokeball had like the HashiCorp logo on it, and now it's become like a little emoji meme in our internal Slack, where it's like, you know, people will basically add the little meme of like got to catch them all. So I think that became almost our like, you know, our unofficial internal meme became that from Mitchell's trip to Japan.
You should put that on the branding page.
I think our branding team would freak
issues
out.
immediately, probably.
Yeah, we might get an email from
probably.
who owns it, Nintendo.
And an invoice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So last one. HashiCorp has a knack for interesting product names like Vagrant and Nomad. Can you reveal the secret behind the naming process, or is it just a random game of Scrabble?
No, it's definitely not a random game of Scrabble. So I think in general, I kind of put our names into like 2 categories. We either have products that are like, I'll call it very descriptive, like Vault. You kind of know what Vault does, right? Or Packer. It's quite literally, it packs things into a box, right? So I think we have either names that are very descriptive and we try and like find those where we can because it makes it, obvious what the tool does. And then I think the other side is I think we have names that I'll call kind of creative, right? Like if you think about like a Nomad as a name. And I think what we try and do with the creative ones is we try and look for sort of an analogy, right? And so like if you think like a nomad, for example, the analogy we went for is like if you think about like a nomadic tribe, right? Like it travels to where the resources are, right? Rather than sort of an agricultural society. And so the job is sort of nomadic, right? And so we're like, that kind of plays with a scheduler, right? Because when you're thinking about submitting a job to Nomad, your job travels to where there's available resources, right? So in that sense, it's kind of like a nomadic tribe. So I think we kind of think about the analogy of some of these things like Terraform, same kind of a concept, right? It's like how do you make an environment habitable for your application? You're sort of terraforming the environment around the application. So I think with those ones, we spend a lot of time thinking about like, okay, what does the tool do? And then what's like kind of a metaphor in some sense of like what the tool does? And then is there kind of a short but memorable and easy to type sort of a name for that? And so it's a difficult process. Some of our products take months for us to have like worked through the naming process.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's horrible because sometimes you find the perfect name and you're like, the domain is taken or it's trademarked.
Yeah. We know like, this problem exactly. It's like you check different platforms where you can host source code. Is the project name taken and so on? And the domain, is there an overlap of different technologies?
Yep.
Speaking of kind of HashiCorp products or technologies in general, what would you say are a bit kind of the industry trends that you identified at the moment, or maybe also potentially for the future as an organization?
What's been interesting is, just reflecting on like maybe the last 3 days in Switzerland is almost without even being asked, almost every customer meeting we've been in, people have brought up on their own, hey, we're thinking about zero trust. How do we actually like change our approach to security? And it's funny to me because some of these things, like they just come in waves, right? Like I feel like we've been talking about zero trust with tools like Vault since like 2015. But it's like as an industry, I finally feel like it's here. You know what I mean? Right? Like the term is here, the thinking is here. People are now saying, hey, it's just the meeting we just came from. They started by being like, hey, we have a very perimeter-centric way of thinking. We harden our outside walls, but the inside is sort of soft. How should we think about zero trust? So to me, I do think as an industry that the moment has finally kind of like come for zero trust. And And I think that's exciting for us, obviously, with like tools like Vault. We've been sort of thinking about it forever. With tools like Console, we've been thinking about it forever. Boundary is sort of a newer one. And I think what we're seeing now is like a lot of organic conversations coming up of people being like, how do I rethink, access management, and how do I do it in a zero trust way? So to me, I think that's an interesting one that's coming up a lot. I think the other one that's coming up separately is sort of this notion of internal developer platform, right? I think we went through almost this explosion of DevOps tooling over the last 10 years, I would say, right? Like, I think I almost chart it by like the size of the CNCF landscape, right? They went from 5 apps to it to now you need sort of an electron microscope, there's 50,000 things on the map. And I think the reaction was like, hey, at the beginning it was about how do you enable developers and get tools like Terraform directly in their hands and let them, go provision and do things. I think now you're almost at a point where it's tooling overload for developers, where they're like, infrastructure is more complicated than it was before we started DevOps. Now I have to learn, 50 different tools and 50 different processes and like, string together 20 different YAML, documents. So now I think almost the pendulum's swinging back the other way, where people are like, can I get an internal developer platform that sort of abstracts infrastructure once again from our developers, right? Like, how do I give them the easy button so they can just focus on their business logic and kind of hide the details of how infrastructure works? So we're seeing that pendulum almost swinging back now, where people are like, I don't want my developers to be experts in Terraform or Nomad or Kubernetes or these other things. Like, they should just focus on building a great Java app, building a great Python app. So to me, that's interesting, and I think we're spending a lot of time in that space with like Waypoint, thinking about like, hey, what's the right abstraction that you give a developer? Can we give them sort of a golden path and a golden workflow, and sort of hide the details of how does Waypoint integrate with Terraform to provision? How does it integrate with Vault to do secret management? Like, the developer shouldn't care about that. They just focus on, hey, I have a Java app, I need to deploy this thing. So I think those two trends are sort of interesting. I think infrastructure as code has been a trend for a while, so I don't think that's kind of new. So I think the other two feel like they're a little bit more of like the emerging trends.
Yeah, really this topic of, I would say, developer experience, and you have somebody starting on the first day, how can they already engage, request new things? Maybe they have a nice, cool idea and they want to start a new project. How can you give everything they need to empower them and start working and actually produce what they want to do instead of filing tickets, yada, yada, yada.
Exactly, yeah.
I think let's have a look what else, what kind of other selection we have here. So the other is ovomaltine, also quite famous.
You get it also as a powder to mix with milk. It's amazing.
It almost reminds me of like the same textures like a Kit Kat.
Mm-hmm.
It's like kind of like
Similar,
biscuity, kind
yes.
of crunchiness
Similar, yeah.
that like a Kit Kat bar has. What region is that one from?
Also Bern.
Oh, also Bern. Okay.
This is also Bern. Bern. This used to be Bern, then
Oh, really?
moved to Zurich because it's linked in Sprünge. This one would be Zurich. Let's talk about data sovereignty. I mean, this is. We see a lot of cloud adoption everywhere, and it's continuously growing. And in Europe, we see that many companies and also public administrations actually are pushing to get full control of their data again. So we see that and we feel that strongly. This is also something that influences the decision if you're using self-managed Vault or HCP Vault and so on. So exactly. So is this development also? Do you see this development also at other customers and in the US, or is this a European thing actually? Because we feel that really strongly.
So it's interesting. I would say it's a global thing, but less of a US thing, right? And I think in some sense the reason you don't see it in the US is most of the hyperscalers are US companies.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit easy. I think in general, U.S. regulators are also generally not as privacy forward maybe as the European ones are. So I think what we end up seeing is, in Europe, it definitely feels like over the last 2-3 years, it's been a dramatic change, right? Like I feel like when you went back to 2019, it was sort of on the edges. It was mostly maybe like, government type companies, public companies that cared more about it. I think over the last 2-3 years, we've seen a pretty big change, right? Where there's like a big focus on data privacy, data residency. I think some of it's driven by the landscape's changing, right? Cloud Act, some of the GDPR revisions, some of the European regulation around it is just different now. So I think we're seeing that drive quite a bit of sort of changed behavior around residency and sovereignty and kind of all that kind of stuff. But I'd say we also see it in parts of Asia, right? So I think you're seeing India's cybersecurity laws is quite a bit different. China's is quite a bit different. Singapore, right? A lot of these sort of countries are now pushing for more data residency, data sovereignty, more control over it. So I do think it's like you're almost seeing the unglobalization of cloud a little bit. And the problem is it also varies so dramatically in terms of when you start getting into the nuances of data residency versus data sovereignty,
Oh, yes.
and it's just like, it's so many shades of gray.
Yeah.
We cannot talk to you without, of course, mentioning the elephant in the room as well. That's been keeping a lot of people and communities busy. So, yeah, recently you announced the license change, right, towards BUSL. And maybe you can give us a bit of insights, and also to our viewers, what were some of the maybe reactions you captured, first feedback that you gathered. Maybe there are some, I don't know, different groups or categories you can mention and explain. That would be super interesting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think it would be helpful. Maybe I'd take a step back and just share like the motivation a little bit, because I think some of that's been lost, and I'll call it a little bit of like the misinformation. So, if I take a step back, what we've spent the last 10 years doing is we built a bunch of software in open source. We built these huge communities, whether it's around Terraform or Vault or Consul. And so we effectively created these large markets around infrastructure as code or secret management or service mesh, right? And I think the challenge with the license of Mozilla Public License was effectively it meant that there's really no barrier to entry for someone entering the market and saying, hey, we're going to take all this sort of community and effort, basically put a sticker on top of it and call it My Cool Terraform or My Cool Vault, and go out and basically sell it back against HashiCorp, right? Without really participating in the community in a meaningful way, right? Like, there's no obligation that you committed a single line of code to any of our products. You could just take it, the Mozilla license, put your sticker on it, and go sell it. And I think that's what we saw happen, right? We saw an emergence of these kind of, I'll call them kind of clone products that basically kind of cloned a bunch of the HashiCorp commercial stuff, didn't really have to spend any R&D effort to actually build any of it, didn't have to spend any marketing effort to evangelize and create these communities, right? But basically came in and would say, hey, I'll sell it, against HashiCorp at a discount effectively without having to have any of the cost of building and maintaining and marketing these communities, right? So I think we saw that pattern emerge. So you're going to then say, okay, great, that's the nature of open source, that's fine. And you're like, that's true, right? And we knew this was possible, we knew this was going to happen at some point, right, if the projects are successful. But then the question is, okay, well, what's your path forward? So your path forward as a company either says, hey, I either continue to put my net new innovation, right? HashiCorp has, we spend probably tens of millions every year in R&D that goes into the open source. So do I continue to put that in open source where I'm just giving this basically directly to my competitors to sell it back against me? Option one, right? It's not a super reasonable option, right, for obvious reasons. Or option two, you say, I'm going to just put all of my net new development in our enterprise products. I'll just put everything into Terraform Enterprise, Consul Enterprise, Vault Enterprise, and that way my competitors can't sell it against me. Or option three, you say, hey, I'm going to change my license very slightly that says you can do pretty much everything except build these clone products, right? And that way I can continue to put my innovation in the open, right? And so that's really, effectively, when you boil it down, those are your three choices.
So you basically would say, okay, we accept that it's happening. It's
right.
Okay. We'll somehow, through different manners, deal with it. You would go full proprietary, you could say, everything enterprise only, so to
right.
speak. Or finally, in the end, the path you choose now with an appropriate license change.
Exactly. And I think and I think the first one is a bit hard to justify, because you're saying, why would you spend tens of millions to arm your competitor? It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Option two didn't feel good, because we're like an open source company. We started from a community. We've developed in the open. Like, we've spent a decade plus doing open source. So like, that felt very wrong to us. And then option three felt like, this is kind of what we saw everybody else do, right? When you saw, what did Mongo do? What did Confluence do? What did Redis do? What did Elastic do, right? So everyone said, we want to continue to develop in the open and support the community, but you don't want to enable your competitors at the same time, right? And so everyone went through a slight relicensing, and effectively, if you look at all of those licenses, they're very broad in terms of what they allow, right? Same thing with the HashiCorp license, right? They're very broad and permissive, but they allow you to continue to innovate in the open, right? And I think for us, we felt like that was the best thing for the community.
It's not considered to be an open source license anymore, right?
No.
So wasn't there an option for, there's tons of open source licenses that might have also covered the use case. How many did you look at, actually?
So we worked with Heather Meeker, who's like kind of one of the experts in open source licensing, right? She's kind of widely renowned in the open source licensing world. And when you look at it, there are a lot of licenses, but they kind of fall in a few categories, right? You have, I'll call them the GPL type licenses. And the challenge with the GPL ones is they'd solve the problem, but most organizations are completely allergic to them, right? Like
Okay.
the moment you see a GPL license, most organizations are like, don't touch
So
it.
the customers are
Yeah,
killer.
because
Oh,
GPL
okay.
is so sticky and
Yes,
so
it is,
viral
yeah.
that nobody wants
It's
to touch it.
often on a deny list if you look at some
Exactly.
open
Unless
source
you're Red Hat.
programs.
Right.
Open source programs of different
most
companies,
people
they
it's a
see, okay,
blacklist.
deny
Yeah.
list, yeah.
Same internally at HashiCorp. Like GPL is on a deny list for us, right?
Oh,
Because
okay.
it's such a
Yeah.
very, sort of a difficult license to deal
Yeah,
with.
to use.
So it would solve our problem, but it's not a great license.
Okay.
Then you have the sort of very permissive licenses. So Mozilla Public License was the one we've had for 10 years. It falls in that category. Sort of same license, if you squint, as Apache or MIT or BSD. They kind of all fall into this very permissive category. But they have no real control, right? Like people can do whatever they want with it. That's by definition. And so it doesn't really solve this problem. And then when you look at kind of the path Confluent and Mongo and Elastic and everybody else went down, it's like there's a few different variants of these things, but all of them kind of have a BSL type of shape, effectively, right? And so I think the nice thing about the BSL is it lets you fine tune specifically what those grants are of what you can do and can't do, where some of the other ones are a bit more cookie cutter. And so for us, what we said is anything you want to do in production is allowable, except use it to create a competitive commercial product using it.
The open source community tends to be quite dogmatic. So how was the backlash? I mean, what came from the community just because it changed? Not because of the impact, just because of the change.
Honestly, I would put the reaction into maybe 3 categories, right? And we were, I would say, completely not surprised.
Okay.
Right? I think category 1 was the vast majority of users, customers, partners, who basically shrugged it off and were like, no impact to me, doesn't change how I use the tool, makes sense for HashiCorp. Then there's I'll call it the kind of open source, kind of more, philosophically oriented around what does pure open source mean? What is pure OSI definition of open source? And I think that can be a bit of a dogmatic definition. And I think those people were rightly, upset, right? They're like, hey, it's not pure open source. And I think one thing we were very careful to do in all of our blog and all of our communication is we don't call it open source anymore. We say it's open, it's source available, it's freely available. But there's a very specific definition of what open source means, and we don't call it that anymore, which is fair, right? I think open source means a very specific thing, so we're not going to call it that. Yeah, it's still open, it's on GitHub, it's freely available, but it doesn't meet the literal definition of OSI. And I think we try to be very respectful of that and not call it what it's not, right? We're not trying to pretend it's open source. It's not, right? It's open, but it's not open source, right? And then I think there's the third category, which was the loudest by far, and that was the directly impacted competitors.
Now, looking forward a bit, would you say this also opens maybe new possibilities that you say, okay, maybe involved enterprise, MFA, or namespaces, whatever you call it, specific features that were restricted more in the enterprise licensed versions? Is that now something you could say, okay, now we have the possibility to move that towards the community editions, for example?
Right. Exactly. That's exactly what enabled. Because otherwise we had these sort of doors, which is, does it go to enterprise or does it go into the community? And it forced us to make some of those trade-offs where there was features where it's like we went back and forth. We're like, should it only be in Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise? And I think because of this, it's actually enabled us to change the way we're going to deliver some of these capabilities and put it into the kind of community version, where before it was like, okay, it wasn't actually obvious. What's the right answer? How should you actually do this? So I think it's exactly that. It's now enabled us to continue to do that innovation in the open, where before maybe we would have made a different decision.
So I guess we earned a piece
Another
of
round of
chocolate,
chocolate.
at least. So let's see. I guess you know the Lindt ones.
The Lindor balls.
They're
These
basically
guys are
available
famous.
almost
Yeah.
everywhere.
They're also famous globally. They might also taste different here now.
Yeah, I wonder if do they have a different Swiss supply chain?
Swiss cow milk. I mean,
Honestly, that milk makes a big difference.
yeah, usually it should, yeah.
That is good.
I love them.
There's a reason they have a global reputation. That
Yep.
was a very good
Usually
chocolate.
you stop eating them once your stomach hurts.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I guess one of your favorite topics we saved for almost the end. Zero Trust, you already mentioned it. Would you see from your point of view, is this now kind of a trend, a bit of a buzzword maybe, that some, I guess, rightly say, others are really sure, no, this is something here to stay. What's your opinion about it?
It's a bit of all three. And what I mean by that is, I think there's a few things that happen, right? One is we've had a series of pretty high-profile breaches in the industry that has driven almost, I'll call it a little bit of a transformation of thinking, and people have realized, you know what, perimeter security is not enough. It's not okay to have these big networks where you can move east-west kind of laterally. So I think there's a shift in the mindset where people are realizing, yeah, perimeter has fundamental problems. So I think that's kind of piece one, and I think that's here to stay because those problems are fundamental, right? Then I think zero trust is definitely a buzzword, right? And I think right now it's like, you know, it almost reminds me of what DevOps was in 2015, where every product was DevOps, right? It didn't matter what the product was, it was a DevOps product. And you're like, this doesn't even make sense, right? It was like, how can this be a DevOps product? And so I think it feels like that right now where everything is a zero trust product, whether or not it makes any sense, you know? And so it definitely feels like there's a lot of kind of marketing hype around it. But to me, if I look at like, what's the trend that's here to stay? I think it's the mindset shift around, how do I move away from I treat my network as confidential, secure, high trust, to I move to a model where I say, I don't trust my network and I assume it's been breached. I assume there's an attacker on the network. I think that mindset shift, I think that's here to stay. I think that trend is here. And I think that's being actually reinforced by changes now in regulatory regime. So in that sense, I think it's here to stay. Whether we call it zero trust, whether it ends up being as hypey as it is, I think that will settle down. In the same way DevOps, you know, people don't put the DevOps sticker on everything anymore. So I think that'll settle, but I think the trend and the philosophy is here to stay.
Something we already also heard this week from different organizations. You have a lot of technologies, they claim or provide certain zero trust capabilities, but especially larger organizations, I guess, have a challenge of saying, okay, well, what is it actually? And on the other side, kind of, what's our roadmap? What's our strategy? How can we do it? And there are, of course, different vendors with different visions based on maybe their background, their strengths, their focus. And something I really appreciate is the work of CISA around their zero trust maturity model. What we've seen different organizations do is that they use it as a kind of strategy or roadmap, so you can visualize it, and then you have a kind of big picture of which capabilities do we need across which areas, and then you can start to add processes and technologies to it, so you kind of have a really nice path forward as a decision maker. Is that also something you encounter across organizations, that they make use of the maturity model?
I think there's now like a few of them actually. Like I think Gartner's put one out as well. I think there's like a few different sort of maturity models to give people sort of at least a framework to think about like what are the pieces of it. I think we often talk about, you know, we talk about the 4-pillar approach that HashiCorp describes, where we focus on like establish human identity first, then establish machine identity, then think about human to machine, then think about machine to machine. So we also have sort of our four-pillar framework that we'll talk to customers about, like, hey, there's a maturity curve, here's how you kind of go through it. So I think there's a few different frameworks. For the most part, they kind of overlap, and they might use different words or slightly different framing, but they kind of all say the same thing. I think Microsoft has a framework around it as well, too. So I think there's a handful of these. They all kind of amount to sort of the same thing, but I think they help the customers at least frame it. Because I think what we often see is we'll go and we'll talk to customers who are like, yeah, we're adopting like a zero trust strategy. And you're like, okay, that's great. Like, what does that actually mean for you? And they're like, we don't know, we're figuring that out. And you're like, okay. And honestly, it reminds me, again, it's like 2015. They were like, we're adopting DevOps. And you're like, what does that mean for you? And they're like, we don't know, but you know, we're gonna figure it out. So that's okay. I mean, I think at least step one is almost like, you know, is accepting that you want to do zero trust. Great, that's an important step one. Step two is figuring out what does that mean? And then I think you're seeing a lot of organizations sort of now, a little bit down the journey, they've established a program. And some of them are using the framework, some of them have made their own frameworks. You know, that's okay. But I do think it's still the early days where we're kind of in that framework, you know, incubation type of phase.
Do you also see kind of, if you look at maybe the HashiCorp products, I would say it covers a lot of ground around identity, application workload, and network. Do you also see maybe HashiCorp growing more into the space of the data-related capabilities or device-related capabilities?
Okay, both really good questions. I think device, no. It's far enough away from what we do. Like, by and large, we focus on application delivery, data centers. That's kind of like our core strength. I think there's a lot of good vendors out there doing sort of device management and endpoint management. So I think that's like not an area we want to spend a lot of time. Data I find super fascinating because I think the challenge with data is, you know, fundamentally that there's not like compute attached to it, right? Like it's some bytes on a disk, right? So how you associate policy with it, I think, is actually very challenging. And I think what makes data even harder is it exists in a bunch of systems already, right? So you have a legacy database with a fixed schema. That data is already there. So now how do I overlay controls on top of that data? Because that data is fundamentally inert, it's being accessed by an application, and so you can't change that application's logic. It might be a legacy app no one's touched in 10 years. So I think what makes data super challenging is you have all these constraints around it, right? Like you have a scale problem, you have a legacy problem, you have an intermediation problem, and then you have data that gets passed between different systems, so has to stay compatible. So the way I think about our involvement with data is sort of twofold, which is like, one is how do you broker the access to it, right? So I think whether it's a human user getting access to a database, like that's where like things like Boundary will play a role. If it's an application getting access, that's where things like Vault play a role. But then I think if we go one level deeper, to me, I think one of the most important techniques is actually how do you use cryptography to encrypt the data at rest, because then you attach the policy to the point of encryption and decryption. Because attaching policy to the data is almost impossible, right? It's like it's a row in a database. How do I attach a policy to that? But if I encrypt the data with something like Vault, and then that ends up in a database, well, I know to use it, at some point you have to come back to Vault. Because you have to come back to say, okay, well, now decrypt it, otherwise I can't do anything with it. And so that gives me a point in time that I can actually attach policy. Because I can say, at encryption time and decryption time, I can make a decision that says, what's your identity? Are you allowed? Yes or no? Can I put tags on this data? And so that's how I end up thinking about it. And I think there's multiple strategies. I think that's almost the pragmatic one, because it allows us to sort of fit it into wherever the app already is or where the data already is. I think there's some next generation data storage systems you see, like next generation databases, next generation sort of data warehouse, that they're trying to push the policy down to the app, to the data layer at the storage point, which I think is cool, but that's a much bigger transformation, because now you have to change your data system, you have to rewrite your application, right? Like that's a big transformation. Versus if you can encrypt or tokenize data in the existing systems, then I can have a policy point, at that point of interaction point. But I think that's what makes data super interesting and hard.
With that said, let's also have a look what else we have stored in here.
Let's come to real Zurich.
Yes, so the Luxembourgerly.
Actually, they're called Luxembourgerly, which is Luxembourg, it's a country.
Sometimes also called macaros.
Yeah, they look like a little French macaron.
They are, by the way, super hard to make yourself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you have to
difficult.
watch out for all the bubbles, otherwise they will split.
They're not as sweet as like a French macaron typically. You think
No.
about like a French macaron's usually like super sweet.
So I would say now, looking at the fifth chocolate category or flavor we have here, it's actually also, I would say, a bit of my favorite, because I love to do those in my free time, especially during Christmas. It's a great present.
Coffee's
Have a
Bakery.
bit, have a small label and a sticker I put on packages.
Side hustle.
And yeah. So yeah, let's have a look, give it a try.
So what are these called?
Praline.
Yes, or I think the usual translation is just chocolates.
Okay. I'll try this one. It looks interesting.
They have a large selection, actually, of different chocolates. I like it. The ones from you are actually better.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, these are really good. I was going to ask if you made these ones.
No,
They would taste even better then.
Okay, so we have to come back to try your special version.
or you can give me your home address and I'll send a,
Okay, there we
a
go.
package.
Package from your Hobby's Bakery.
All right, so with that we come to an end, and we thank you so much for being with us and the discussion, and we also hope you, of course, enjoyed the small tasting here. Next time, I guess, we'll maybe look at some cheese options. And for you, our dear viewers, thank you so much for sticking around. Please give us a subscription and a like, and see you next time. Enjoy.